Here's a batch of problems where you get the graph and it says write a formula representing the trig function graphed below. You can use sine or cosine. I'm going to use cosine. Notice how it starts with a peak, so it looks a little more like a cosine curve. The first thing I'll do is between the peak and the trough, the midpoint is at 1. So that looks like a cosine of something or other plus 1. Okay, notice it doesn't seem to have a horizontal shift, so you're not going to have a plus inside because the peak is right there. If you were using a sine, you would actually need a horizontal shift. Okay, so plus 1. Notice my amplitude, how far up and down I go from that midline, is 1. So those are fairly straightforward. But my period, remember, is 2 pi over b. Well, what's my period here? Notice you can't actually see a whole period, but you can see half a period. Half a period is 2 pi here. Peak to trough, then trough to peak is another 2 pi. So p is going to equal 4 pi. What's that make b? Well, you could cross multiply. You could say b equals 2 pi over 4 pi, which is 1/2. So what I end up with is 1/2 x. The nice thing about these kind of problems is if you have a test formula, you can actually plug it into Desmos and see that that's exactly right. Well, this one's a little different. Notice that again, it's 0 to 2. So I'm going to have an amplitude of 1 and a shift up by 1. But something's happening in between. The period is pi, right? So I need p, you can write it as 2 pi over p equal to b also. Not shockingly, that formula can be converted to that. So I have 2 pi over, and my real period is pi. So can you see that b is going to be 2? But then I have a shift, right? This is not the peak. This is the peak. Well, what do I do there? If I'm going to shift right for a cosine curve, I'd put minus pi halves. That's not the only way to do this, by the way. There are other correct answers. One would be actually to have a vertical shift, a negative out in front. But this is one correct answer. Finally, on this sheet, I have this graph. Well, notice here my trough is at -2, my peak is at 4, half the distance is at 1. So it looks like this is still cosine of something or other plus 1, but now my amplitude is 3, right? So my peak is at 3 plus 1, my trough is at -3 plus 1. Okay, what's happening inside? Well, it seems like I'm not shifted right or left. This is a standard cosine curve, but my period, peak to peak, is 2. So period equals 2. 2 equals 2 pi over b. So b is going to equal 2 pi over 2, or pi. And so I get pi x. And you can check that on Desmos as well.